How is the theme of gender presented in J.B. Priestley's play An Inspector Calls? Let's find out. How's it going, Revision Squad? It's me, Liam, aka Mr. Knight, aka DystopiaJunkie, and in this video I'm going to discuss how the theme of gender is presented in J.B. Priestley's play An Inspector Calls. I'll explain what I mean by that theme, analyse quotations that are relevant to it, and also discuss why Priestley might have included this theme in his play. Remember that discussing an author's possible intentions could contribute to you achieving the very top grades. Make sure that you have got a pen and some paper out in front of you so that you can take notes of the things that I say over the course of the video, as most of them won't be appearing on screen. Please do not forget to like, comment and subscribe if this video helps you out, as that helps me out loads too. Okay, so what do I mean when I say that this video is looking at the theme of gender? Gender is a very complicated term, and so in perhaps a simplistic way, I would say that gender is a spectrum of characteristics that pertain to masculinity and femininity, and how these interact in order to form a part of someone's identity. Now, in the 21st century, gender is a vast, diverse and multifaceted thing. However, in J.B. Priestley's time, gender was viewed as being more connected with biological sex, reducing it to a binary of masculinity and femininity, or in more simple terms, I guess, men and women. So this theme could be seen as being the depiction of men and women in the play, or male and female characters in the play. But it's not just how men are presented, or how women are presented. It is also how men treat women, women treat men, men treat men, and women treat women. Did you get all of that? Now, your exam question might not use the exact word gender in its question. Instead, it could ask you about masculinity versus femininity, or the depiction of men and women, or just one of these on their own, or even gender stereotypes. So where do men act in a hyper-masculine way, or women in a hyper-feminine way? Or where are these roles inverted? Within this, you could also consider the romantic and sexual relationships in the play, and how these might interact with those gender stereotypes. So our first quotation for gender comes from Mrs. Birling, and she says, "Now, Sheila, don't tease him. When you're married, you'll realise that men with important work to do sometimes have to spend nearly all their time and energy on their business. You'll have to get used to that, just as I had." This quotation establishes stereotypical and historically traditional gender roles at the start of the play, or it at least establishes that Mrs. Birling accepts them. When she says that some men have important work to do, there is the slight implication that women do not, as would have been typical for the middle and upper classes in pre-war Britain, whereas her acknowledgement that they sometimes have to spend nearly all their time and energy on their work perpetuates the traditional stance that men were supposed to be the main breadwinner and provider for the household. When she advises her daughter that "you'll have to get used to that, just as I had," Mrs. Birling's acceptance of traditional gender roles is reinforced, as she is trying to force the same stance onto Sheila, again trying to perpetuate those traditional gender roles. It is these gender roles that's crumpled and warped over the course of the 2 World Wars. Our second quotation about gender comes from Eric. He says, "Mother says we mustn't stay too long, but I don't think it matters. I left them talking about clothes again. You'd think a girl had never had any clothes before she gets married. Women are potty about them." Now, I would say that Eric's dialogue here is sexist. There is something a bit derisory when he expresses that he left his mother and sister talking about clothes again, as if their topic of conversation is simple or inconsequential or vapid. I think that this sentiment is also expressed by his final sentence, "Women are potty about 'em," which makes it clear that he thinks women are mad or a bit silly in their obsession with clothes, an effect that is particularly created by the informal adjective potty. Furthermore, by using the general term women, Eric's dialogue also suggests that he thinks that all women are the same, again making his dialogue sexist. However, I think the first two sentences of Eric's dialogue are perhaps even more sexist. The first sentence, "Mother says we mustn't stay too long," expresses a command given by a female character, which Eric immediately negates with his second sentence, "But I don't think it matters." This dismissive attitude towards a command given by a female character suggests that Eric thinks that women, even his own mother, have little to no authority, and that they are secondary to men. And so this quotation reveals to us that male characters in the play, they might look down on female characters. Quotation number 3 comes from an interaction between the inspector and Gerald. When the inspector asks, "And you think young women ought to be protected against unpleasant and disturbing things?" Gerald responds with, "If possible, yes." Because Gerald admits that he thinks that young women ought to be protected against unpleasant and disturbing things, it could be argued that he also exhibits a sexist attitude. Because he thinks that young women ought to be protected by him, a man, it is implied that Gerald might consider women to be weak, fragile, and inferior to men. Although this is not necessarily exactly as negative as Eric's earlier sexist views, he still seems to believe that women are lesser. A more sympathetic reading of this is that Gerald is performing in a stereotypically masculine way by trying to protect women. I'll let you decide which interpretation you agree with more. Our fourth quotation also relates to Gerald, who says, "I hate those hard-eyed, dough-faced women." Here, his passive sexism has been elevated to outright misogyny, as evidenced by the explicit verb hate. However, it is important to note which women in particular Gerald hates. He describes them as being hard-eyed and dough-faced, compound adjectives which make it clear that these women are unattractive. This suggests then that Gerald hates ugly women, the reverse of which is that he only values and likes attractive or pretty women. Priestley could be suggesting then that, to the middle and upper classes in 1912, only beautiful women had value. Our fifth quotation comes from the inspector, but it is about Mrs. Birling. The inspector says, "She needed not only money, but advice, sympathy, friendliness. You've had children. You must have known what she was feeling. And you slammed the door in her face." So I've selected this quotation as so far we have only had quotations that look at how men view women. However, in the inspector's dialogue, we get a summary of how a female character has viewed and treated another female character. Eva Smith is presented in an incredibly pitiable way, as not only does she need money, but advice, sympathy, friendliness. An instance of triadic structure which creates the impression that she is totally alone in the world. The inspector asserts that Mrs. Birling must have known what Eva was feeling since she has had children herself. Despite this, she slams the door in Eva's face, an idiom which tells us not only that Mrs. Birling rejected Eva's appeal for help, but that she did this harshly and without feeling. This is all important because it shows that there is no gender loyalty. Mrs. Birling does not sympathise with and support a fellow woman, as Mrs. Birling is so entrenched in those gender stereotypes and the patriarchal society of 1912. The inspector also gives us our next quotation, and this time he is talking about Eric. He says, "Just used her for the end of a stupid, drunken evening, as if she was an animal, a thing, not a person." This quotation tells us a few different things about gender. First, because Eric just used Eva and treated her as an animal, a thing, not a person, we see again how a male character mistreats a female character in a display of gender inequality, and treats them as if they are something secondary and lesser than themselves. However, not all men seem to view themselves as being superior to women. The inspector's dialogue is quite disdainful and critical. He calls Eric sleeping with Eva the end of a stupid, drunken evening, with the two adjectives stupid and drunken in particular creating the critical tone in his dialogue. This could imply that the inspector, the most socialist and caring character in the play, disapproves of the predatory stance that men adopt when viewing women. This further suggests that the inspector does not view himself as being superior to women because he is a man, something which sets him apart from the other male characters in this play. And the inspector also gives us our penultimate quotation. It comes from his final speech, and he says, "We are members of one body." This quotation is useful from a number of different angles, including when thinking about the theme of gender. The use of the plural pronoun we encompasses all people, all classes, all genders, and shows that, in the inspector's opinion, men and women are equal, as they are members of one body. Therefore, the presentation of gender in this play is made a bit more multi-dimensional. Whereas the vast majority of the characters either adhere to, perpetuate, or embrace gender stereotypes and the notion of male superiority, the inspector comes in and tries to show them that men and women should be united and regarded as equals. This is one of his lessons: equality, including gender equality. And finally, we have a quotation from Mrs. Birling. Once the inspector has left and the Birlings have discussed how unusual he was, but before Gerald has returned, Mrs. Birling tells Eric and Sheila, "Now just be quiet so that your father could decide what we ought to do." She looks expectantly at Mr. Birling. On one hand, we see a mother telling her children what to do. You could argue that there is something maternal in this quotation then. However, more importantly in my opinion is what Mrs. Birling says and does next. She tells her children that they must all wait for Mr. Birling to decide what their plan of action is. The stage directions, which tell us that she looks expectantly at her husband, gives us another example of something gender-based that we can comment on. Here, she looks to her husband and expects him to take charge, which I think is another example of Mrs. Birling embracing those gender stereotypes. Men are in charge and women do as they are told. I also wanted to include this quotation as it bookends nicely with the first one in this video. At the start of the play, Mrs. Birling accepts, embraces and perpetuates those gender stereotypes. By the end of the play, she does the exact same thing. The depiction of gender has not necessarily changed. Mrs. Birling, a woman, believes that her place will always be secondary to men, as she is so entrenched in those traditional gender roles. She has not learned or gained anything from the inspector's teachings, certainly not with regards to gender. Perhaps this is Priestley's way of suggesting that the problem of gender inequality is so massive that it cannot be resolved over the course of one evening, or that it is something that cannot be fixed by one person alone. So now it is time to consider J.B. Priestley's intentions, which should help you to achieve the top grades in your exam. Just like with characters, you can analyse themes with the author's intentions in mind. So why did Priestley make gender a theme of An Inspector Calls? First of all, I feel that Priestley has presented gender in the way that he has in his play in order to highlight the progress made in gender equality between 1912, when the play is set, and 1945, when it was first performed. Prior to 1912, gender roles were much more rigid and defined, but this was shaken up and challenged by the terrors of the two world wars. With the vast majority of fit and able men serving in the forces in this period, women's roles changed, and many of them, irrespective of class, took on roles and jobs that would have previously been men's and men's only. Priestley's audience in 1945 may have therefore seen the depiction of gender in this play as a bit backwards or archaic, reminding them of how far society had come along, but also warning them of the woeful levels of inequality that they could revert back to if they were not careful. Therefore, by highlighting the progress made between 1912 and 1945, Priestley is both praising his contemporary society, but giving it a warning too. Secondly, and in a similar vein, Priestley may have depicted gender in the way that he did in his play in order to problematize the patriarchy. Patriarchy, if you're not aware, is a word that describes a society in which men have power and women are generally excluded from positions of power and authority. Generally, the men in this play do not treat women particularly well, an attitude that seems to have trickled down to the female characters' attitudes too. Many of the bad things experienced by Eva, and by extension maybe working class women more generally, are the direct result of the poor attitude towards women that men generally seem to hold in this play. By showing how this negative attitude can compound and create an aggregate effect that ultimately ended in a young woman killing herself, Priestley may have been inviting his audience to query whether or not it was right that men had the majority of the power in 1912. He might want them to ask whether or not Eva's fate would have been avoided if women had more of a say in 1912. So that is my discussion of the theme of gender in An Inspector Calls done. But what could you do next? Well, if you're after some more quotations, you could look specifically at how Mr. Birling treats or views his employees, many of whom are women. You could also do the same with how Eva was treated by Sheila, as I think this reaction was particularly gender-based. Page references are up on the screen for you and are based on the version of the play that I have, which is this one. Furthermore, you could look at the interactions held between the male characters, which is perhaps exemplified by the banter that Mr. Birling and Gerald have at Eric's expense on pages 9 and 10. I know that most of the quotations and analyses in this video have included female characters in some way, and so looking at the male-male interactions might add an interesting alternative angle to your analysis, something that I think you really ought to do if you're looking for those grade 8s and 9s. And you could also look at the quality that almost all of the characters seem to think is the most important when it comes to women. The pages that I've listed, 14, 18, 34, 52, they all make reference to the exact same quality or aspect about women. If this is the quality that is the most important one when thinking about women, what does that say about how women are viewed and treated by society? Now, whether or not you choose to find those extra quotations, You could also remember to like the video if it's helped you out. Leave a comment on it, either letting me know how useful the video has been, giving me some of your own analysis, or asking me a question. And of course, if you aren't already, you really should subscribe to my channel too. But whatever it is that you choose to do, I hope that you have an awesome rest of the day. If you are revising, please do remember to take frequent short breaks, as a burned out student is not a happy or successful student, which is what I think you deserve to be. So there we go, that's how the theme of gender has been presented in An Inspector Calls. But which one quotation do you think best summarises the depiction of that theme across the entire play? Please do let me know down in the comment section below. Cheers.